Hello everyone, and welcome back to another ZBrush speed sculpt video, and for today we're going to be working on the Satirus Spinosaurus. So you're probably thinking, what is this and why am I doing it? And the answer to both of those questions is this is just a great big over-the-top joke, essentially. So the Satirus Spinosaurus, as you can probably guess by the name, is a satirical Spino. So expect there to be no realism in this whatsoever. Well, I guess like fictional realism, but it's definitely not going to be scientifically accurate at all, and that is the entire point of this. The idea for this came from the fact that over my many years in sport, I have received my fair share of, shall we just say, bad advice regarding what Spinosaurus looked like, because it's my favourite dinosaur. I always really liked making it in sport, I'd make it quite a lot, and it would infuriate a fair few people because, oh, how dare I get certain features wrong. And it prompted me to eventually make a satire video, which I would highly recommend you go watch if you want to know more about this. It's probably my funniest video I've made, I really like it, and it shows how this concept originally came to be and why it looks the way it looks. As for why am I doing this? Honestly, just because I wanted to. I thought it'd be funny. It's probably my most try-hard joke, but honestly I'm kind of proud of how it came out. I think that all things considered, you know, considering it's just a great big troll, all things considered, I did learn a lot from this, and at the end of the day, that's why I do a lot of these sculpts, is I like learning from them. I like learning techniques, I like learning just ideas in general, how to do certain techniques or certain patterns, or like, especially musculature and anatomy. This one was a big challenge for learning musculature and anatomy, but again, a really good opportunity. And in this case, I wanted to make like a very fictional creature that looked believable. Now, again, this is going to be very far-fetched, but I think it came across looking fairly believable to the end, towards the end even. If I was more experienced and more realistic type of sculpt, like paleo arts, for example, I think this probably could have passed. You know, again, obviously very unrealistic, but as a believable creature, like think of like Arvalus, for example, RJ Palmer and his Pokemon and Monster Hunter creatures. That's the kind of thing I had in mind for this, in terms of, you know, like fantasy realism. So, like I said, overall, a bit of a joke, bit of fun, and especially just personal practice and personal learning. When it came to the overall posing, I guess, and the anatomy of this creature, so the posing was going to be the exact same as that of a sport creature, and that was based on very mixed advice I'd received. That 1, this is a biped, 2, it's a quadruped, 3, it's a tripod, which means the really old school, you know, tail dragger that you'd see in like the really old original like T-Rex depictions. So all together, tripod, biped, and quadruped. Also knuckle walker, which was another one. So as you can imagine, like overall, just like a very bizarre posing, and the overall thing I went for that was like a very squat looking appearance. Some more advice I'd gotten were things like the forearms had to be really long, the back legs had to be really short, and very bulky and very muscular. So that is why that towards the end of this, the legs just look proportionately, the hind legs just look proportionally just giant, and that's intended. A lot of the weird things in this model are going to be very intended, just so you're aware. But again though, like that's the overall kind of posing I had in mind. And it was kind of tricky to translate, as one can imagine. I can already see I'm struggling at the beginning here, because in my mind, I want the arms and legs to be about the overall same size as if it was a quadruped, and I'm having a very hard time positioning the squat position. It kind of worked out eventually. I think the long neck and tail really offset it, and of course the spine. The overall technique I used to actually create the shapes of the body really helped out a lot, especially the musculature, and that was by making everything in individual subtools and layers. So I was able to make the forearm and the bicep separate, I was able to make the thigh and the calf separate, and it just overall allowed me to add in like very early definition without actually physically merging anything together, and it's just a nice way to get some really simple proportions, musculature, definition, etc. into the model without actually doing any detail yet. And I think the overall earlier stages of the model really did look quite nice. It looked somewhat convincing, or at least, you know, recognizable as a Spinosaurus. Just the posing was obviously off, but in terms of like the overall proportions, I think the tail was nice and large. I think the sail was really nice and defined. Of course, the head, I initially started with the head based on the skulls of Spinosaurus, because as we're going to see, it's going to look very different later on. But I think, like, for the overall basics for the creature, I think that the earlier draft really came out looking pretty nice. So once I was overall happy with the initial draft, it then came to a point of just adding like a little bit of creasing here and there, especially around the neck, around the collarbone, just like a bit of folds of skin here and there, and then overall just better defining the head, adding in the teeth as well, making sure that I've got like all the conical teeth where I want it to be, getting the eyes in place, make sure everything's like in the right placement, and then the trunk. Yes, trunk. One person told me that Spinosaurus had a trunk. They even provided me with sources and articles for it. So, of course, my satirical concept here had to have a trunk as well. And I'll tell you what, that was challenging. Both in terms of my immorality, because it's my favourite dinosaur, but also in terms of just how to add it in, because I've always found it really strange how it was ever conceived that a big carnivorous creature with great big giant teeth had such like a fleshy mass coming off its nose. It just seemed weird to me, and I wasn't really sure how I could actually, you know, make this, how I can make this big carnivore have a big fleshy thing in terms of like just the overall appearances. So I decided to have it be roaring. I looked up images of a tapir, and in that I can see that when it, you know, also roars, I guess more like makes a sound, its trunk kind of goes upwards. So that's the kind of thing I tried to aim with this, but it was really tricky though, because it just felt really proportionally off. It felt strange having the upper jaw just be so huge and bulbous, and the lower jaw be so slender and small. And I couldn't have the trunk be too long either, because that just made that issue worse. So, like I said, it really was just odd. Took a lot of trial and error, and you will see me nitpicking it again and again, here and there and back. A part of the way that I did try to offset it was by, one, having the neck really drag out and just like having a very, very floppy skin around the neck. I did also try to make the underjaw, the lower jaw, a little bit larger as well, since, as we've all heard of before, a lot of paleo art has, what's it called, shrink wrapping, where there's no flesh around the bone. And I think that's like especially the case, at least, you know, like in terms of this, you know, this interpretation of this silly satirical thing, I think that was going to be the case with the lower jaw here, so I did try to puff it out just a little bit more. In hindsight, I wish I did actually do a lot more with that. I wish I gave it a lot more like flesh, a lot more osteoderms, etc. But in the end, I did keep it a little bit more simplistic. But I think overall I was able to strike somewhat of a balance with the trunk. Again, it was really odd. It was really, really a bit of a struggle, but I think I got there eventually. And hence, you know, that interesting hurdle trying to create a fictional, realistic creature. Well, I hope realistic anyway. Moving on from that, I was then working on the spine. So for the spine, it was another interesting hurdle, because I've gotten, like, in my own mind, the way that I've always grown up seeing Spinosaurus, it would have, like, this very bony, ridged spine, but I had people telling me that it's very fleshy, it's a hump, that the spine isn't visible. All these very weird, you know, varying bits of information. So I had a bit of an idea for this one, since this was such a clash of information once again. And I had an idea to include a couple of spines, and have the spines, like the tips of them, kind of protrude out of the hump. I guess you could say like a very visible vertebrae coming out the back of you. And it was weird, it was definitely very strange. I think it was creative. I like it as a creative concept. Just something to make this a bit more original, a bit more mine. Because I didn't want this just to be like some generic, you know, amalgamation of features. I did want to add like a little bit of personality and a little bit of my own thoughts and ideas into this here and there. A bit of, you know, like artistic liberties. And I think having the spikes, or the spines, excuse me, kind of poke out, and then you just see like the rest of the flesh in the hump kind of drag down below it. It looked really gross, it looked a little bit weird, but I think it looked quite original, and I actually quite liked the way it came out. Not to mention, it helps convey the whole M shape, which is another thing I hear is being disputed now. I'm really struggling to keep up with Spinos, I swear. Overall though, I think that the overall concept kind of like helped make it a bit more unique. After that, it was then a case of just shaping out the feet a bit more. As we all know, I've got like a big issue drawing hands and feet in ZBrush. I really, really struggle with it, but I think this has probably been one of my better versions so far. And I especially tried to add like a lot of flapping and skin and wrinkles around the feet. That's another thing I've also noticed a lot of modern paleo art, is that the creatures are very, very wrinkly, so I tried to really emphasize that in this. You know, trying to make it look like modern paleo art, but obviously with a much more satirical look. So after adding a whole bunch more wrinkles to the tail, to the torso, the neck, and of course the hind legs, it was then time to work on the forearms. So like I mentioned earlier, this was described to be a knuckle walker. And I did not know how to draw that, so I was originally looking at interpretations of Chalicotherium, which I recognised from Ark Survival Evolved, and don't worry, I didn't look at, actual real interpretations of the Chalicotherium, but that's where I heard the creature from. And I felt like that did a really elegant idea of allowing me to get the kind of a wrist placement and how the fingers and such would kind of position. But I had the live stream audience recommend me looking at gorilla for the overall proportion of the arms. Now, on the one hand, a gorilla and a Chalicotherium for that matter are both mammals, so I reckon that their overall, the definition and intensity of muscles in the arms might be different than it would be in a reptile. I don't know for sure, but I imagine that to be the case. But in the end though, using a gorilla, it was just a perfect thing in regards to overall stance and positioning. It was probably the best shot I had for getting muscles, because I really don't think there is such a thing as a knuckle dragging reptile, not that I can think of on the top of my head. So having a gorilla for the reference, it helped. In the end, it did make the arms look a bit too swole. Again, that's the really nice perk about doing this silly thing, is that it really allowed me to really learn and get practice, because I'm trying to do musculature a lot more nowadays, trying to really focus on it, like the overall anatomy of a creature, more than just the skin on top, but a bit more of the flesh underneath. And I think on this one, I really overdid it. But again, good learning opportunity. I'm happy I get to say I overdid it, because it means I've learned from it. I've learned not what to do in the future. And after that, it's just a case of getting all the fingers and toes and claws in place. For the claws, for the forearms and the hand claws, I did end up making them very, very large and curved. Now, I'm not actually sure if that's correct, or maybe I had them too curved, but I felt like that just for this creature, I thought it would just give it a bit more personality, a bit more, again, more characteristic if I did do these very large, round claws. I felt like that if I made them too straight, it would look like a Spinosaurus, and that wasn't exactly the thing I was after. I wanted something very, I guess, raptor-like in a way. And then for the back claws, the back feet, they were just a lot more subdued than what you'd expect to see. I did also add an additional residual pinky claw. I can't think of the actual proper term for this. There's a word for it. But I did add a little additional toe or finger to the forearms. The reason why this has 4 fingers and 4 toes, by the way, is because I was also told it was a tetrapod, meaning it had 4 digits. So that was easy enough to translate into the back legs. But to the forearms, I decided to make the pinky finger much smaller. And I think, again, it just gave it a bit more personality. The way that I made it, I had inspiration from a hoof from a hadrosaur, if I remember correctly. I remember looking at that and seeing how the early interpretations before the hoof had these little funny, floaty, useless claws, and I went with that kind of idea for this. I think it, again, gave it just a bit more personality than if I had just, 4 standard claws. So after the hands and feet, I then went on to just tidy up the arms a little bit more, make them look a little bit more subdued. I think it still looked incredibly ripped, and I continued to fix that a little bit more later on. But after, subduing it a little bit more, I then took a step back and looked at the overall posing. Had to turn the hind legs backwards slightly because the entire thing was kind of hunched together. I went to make the spine a bit bigger because now that I've added so much flesh and mass to everything, the spine looks really small by comparison. So I went ahead and made that larger. Added a bit of flesh as well, really wanted to get that whole, fleshy look sold. So I kind of made it look really dragged down, really heavy, overlapping the thighs and the hips a little bit. Kind of gross, but I think it worked out quite nicely. And then I also noticed that the way that the tail was kind of awkwardly floating just looked bizarre. So I then had that collapse onto the floor like actual gravity. Made it a little bit wider around the base so it looks like you can actually physically see it, pressed against the surface of the floor. And of course, obligatory 2020 tail design. I had to add that in, there's no way I couldn't do that. And then my next goal was to move on to the mouth and teeth and just give a bit more detail to all of that, since I feel like the face is going to be such a eye-catching thing. I wanted to make sure that I had the gums in place, I wanted to make sure that the trunk was all, nice and wrinkled. It was kind of tricky trying to figure out the lips in particular, because the lower jaw, at least based on my current understanding, I think the lower jaw is kind of like a crocodile, or both jaws and Spinosaurus like a crocodile, I think, where the teeth kind of jut through the gums, or not even the gums, more just through the mouth. So I had that in mind for the lower jaw, but then that wouldn't make any sense for the upper jaw because it's got this big fleshy mass. It's gonna have gums up there, and overall it was just really strange. I'll be honest. It was really strange. It was another example of how I need to try and translate this fictional thing and make it, you know, somewhat realistic, and I think it was a bit of a clash, but I did want to keep the whole crocodile concept of the teeth poking out the lower jaw. I wanted to keep that. I think I overall struck a bit of a balance eventually. The idea I had in mind was for the trunk to kind of transition from like big rigid bold scales in the head into like a much more delicate texture around the nose. Now I know normally it'd be fleshy. I'm not sure what it actually is in this. I'm just gonna leave it down to interpretation when it comes to like the scales and or like the texturing and the colours. But I think I kind of nailed some kind of, you know, transient effect. Again, leave it to interpretation as to where the scales end and where the flesh begins, if at all. After that, a bit more work on the tongue, nice and sad, and after that, I then tried to add a little bit more personality to this. So like I said earlier, I didn't want this just to be some crazy amalgamation of features. I wanted to actually have like a bit more personality to it, a bit more me work. So I added a bit of ridges around the eyes. I added the sort of little cresting thing around the forehead between the eyes. I started adding a lot more flesh as well around the tail, again around the hump, to try to make everything look even bigger and heavier. Added a bit of webbed skinning between the thigh and the body, so that's another trait I see very, very frequently in paleo art. So another one I want to try and grab here as well. And otherwise, after just a whole plethora of just working on the skin, the surface, the muscles, etc., I then decided to actually give this thing some spikes, since that's always just been a personal favourite of mine. Maybe it's wrong, I don't know, it's just like a childhood favourite, is that I've always liked seeing dancers with a bit of spikes here and there, whether it be horns, quills, doesn't matter, just some kind of adornments. And I wanted to keep that, you know, that little childhood wonder in this as well, make it look big and monstrous. And so for that, I gave it some spikes going down the top of the head and neck, as well as through the tail, kind of like poking out like spines. And I also added some spikes around the throat as well, kind of resembling that of a iguana. Which again, I felt like just gave the entire thing a bit more personality. And then sort of added some osteoderms to the top of the neck and around the shoulder and back, again just to give it a bit more of a rugged, you know, bigger, hardier appearance. And then after that was a case of just adding in more and more wrinkles. Like I said, I've seen it's a very common trait nowadays of paleo art to have just tons of wrinkles and skin folds everywhere. Again, just like the musculature, I think I've overdone it here. But again, it was fun to try out, it was fun to learn and, you know, trial and error it out. I especially made the neck far too wrinkly, I reckon. Though I have also seen paleo art with incredibly wrinkly necks, so I guess maybe it's just a personal taste. I'm not sure, it's something I need to learn. Something I need to practice. But I do like the overall execution and idea, and as I added more and more wrinkles to the neck, the rest of the body felt a bit bare, so I did go back to certain areas, such as around the stomach and thighs, around the legs, around the tail, just added in more and more in other places too. That way all the wrinkles wasn't secluded to the neck. Wanted to be a bit more consistent among the design. And eventually also added a bunch of it to the tail as well, to the tip of the tail. As the more I worked on this, the tail just felt more and more neglected. So I tried just adding in lots of various lines into the, I guess you could say like rudder or flipper part of the tail, the spinier part. I'm not sure the technical term here. Just tried to make that look a bit more delicate, a bit more textured, if you will. And then once I was happy with the overall design, just before I was getting ready for detail, I then realised I forgot the webbing on the hands and feet, as that was another feature that I had recommended to me. As this was another trait that I've been advised to in previous creations. And of course, the whole idea of this big knuckle-dragging webbed feet thing is just getting more and more complicated, but I tried my best here, and I tried to add a bit of webbing where I could. Then after all the finishing touches, it was then time to finally start adding the scales. The scales I really had a bit of a hard time with, to be honest, because I couldn't really decide or choose which sort of style or pattern I wanted to go with. I did want there to be lots of small scales, want to be like fairly neat, because at least in my own interpretation, I thought like much larger creatures have much smaller scales in proportionate to them. Kind of like eyes. You'll notice how a much larger creature they have smaller eyes than a smaller creature, and it just kind of gives like a good sense of like grandiose scale when it comes to illustration. So I tried to go with a bit of a similar idea for this and just have lots of small scales, but again though, it got to a point where I wasn't really quite happy with the idea, as I didn't want there just to be lots of the same scale, because it was looking very, very samey and very boring in some places, kind of a bit jarbled. So that's a bit of trial and error. One way I tried to solve this little dilemma was by masking areas around the neck and just tried to mask up areas where I want small scales and large scales and have them kind of clash and, you know, mix together. And I think it somewhat worked. It's entirely possible I was just too paranoid because, you know, I feel like the textures or the colours would have then hidden it afterwards. But it was something I was really struggling with for a while. But I stuck to my guns and I kept on with it. In certain other areas, I did also try to have like a bit more of a nicer, neater, consistent design, especially around the neck, for example, the throat. I wanted the throat to look very delicate by comparison. I wanted the upper parts to be very hardened, but the lower parts to be nice and delicate and soft. And you'll see we change materials around every now and then as well, masking and hiding lots of areas to reduce lag and changing materials, so I've got different ideas of lighting and shadows and depths. I think it helped out a fair bit in the overall, you know, just the overall placement of scales. At one point though, around the belly and torso in particular, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the scales looking very samey, and I think around the torso, that problem was like really becoming very, very clear, as you can just see lots of splotches of the same alpha pressed again and again, and it just looks horrible, to be honest. So one way I combated that was just by adding in a bit of a mixture of scales in between and just really trying to, I guess, just keep on overlapping it, which might not be the most elegant solution, but I think it eventually worked. Again, big emphasis on the fact that I wanted small scales, so it did mean that this reoccurring pattern, or this repeating pattern, would keep on reoccurring. And the best I can really do is just, you know, kind of work around it and add like blemishes and imperfections and break the patterns here and there. And again, I think it came out okay in the end. Maybe not perfect, but another learning opportunity. And then when it came to the sail and hump, this area in particular, I specifically designed to have look intentionally very similar. I wanted this area to look quite flat because the idea I had in my mind was that the sail would be completely sold by the colours. It needed to have big, bright, colourful colours. So it didn't really matter how the scales were, and I didn't want them to be like big, rough-looking osteoderms either. I intentionally wanted this area to look a bit more smooth and delicate, kind of like the belly, because it's meant to be a big fleshy hump. So I think that came out okay in the end. And then after adding copious amounts of scales everywhere, it was then a case of just adding in more alphas in various places, such as a bit of a cross-hatching idea around the neck and torso and tail, kind of mimicking that of a crocodile where they had these very square-like scales kind of jutting everywhere. I thought I'd just break up the monotony of this and just, you know, like really kind of separate the belly from the chest, for example. Also around the face, did a lot of masking using much heavier alphas for this one. I wanted the face to be really powerfully defined, again like a crocodile, where their facial scales are just really defined and they really pop out at you, they look very big and hardened. I wanted the same thing here, so that meant just, you know, kind of piecing together lots of various different alphas. Masking things up, mix and matching. Like I mentioned earlier, trying to also figure out the lower jaw versus the upper jaw, the flesh versus the scale. I think I did come to a fairly elegant solution in the end. It looks really cool and defined, but I'm just not sure, like, you know, as they say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and I'm just hoping that it's not just my own bias, and that the way I've separated the two jaws looks okay. I hope so. And one little cool thing I did learn, by the way, was that all of these scale patterns I've been using actually work really nicely for the tongue. I've always had a bit of an issue with the tongue because I've never really known how to texture it, so I tend to use skin-like textures, like human skin, for the tongue. And I realised that upon using like a couple of scales here and there, and then later on I colour in like scales, it actually really popped out. Speaking of colouring, so normally in my videos I would have the colouring alongside the modelling. But for this time round, I've done something a bit more special. The colouring for this creature is going to be in part 2, and that one is going to be commentated in real time, since a lot of you have requested, you know, how do I do my textures, how do I decide on it? And the truth is, I can't really tell you, I kind of just wing it as I go along. So for the entire colouring of this model, you'll be able to find all that in part 2, all in real time, so you're going to hear my actual thoughts in the process, my decision making, why I've done this and that and so on. And hopefully that can be very helpful, not just for ZBrush users, but for all artists in general. At least, I hope so. More of a theory video than it is a tutorial. But anyway, that is going to be me done for now then. We've expended the entirety of the detailing and modelling design of this creature, why it looks the way it looks, and just what an awful monstrosity this is. And if you want to see the colouring and the finish, then please watch out for part 2. It'll either be in the upper right hand corner or it'll be in the video description afterwards. So, thank you all very, very much. I hope you've learned a fair bit from this, and I hope you've enjoyed the overall, the thoughts, the decision making, the ideas, and of course the concept itself is a very special concept, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much, and cheers. Take care.